If Canada makes a deal with China, it will immediately be hit with a 100% tariff against all Canadian goods and products coming into the United States of America. Donald Trump, Saturday morning, threatening to destroy the entire Canadian economy over a trade agreement he praised 1 week earlier. Not a strategic policy shift, pure panic. Because Mark Carney just did exactly what Trump claims to want, negotiated a bilateral trade deal that benefits Canadian farmers. And Trump realized it makes Canada less dependent on American markets. The whiplash is extraordinary. January 16th, Trump says the China deal is a good thing. January 24th, same deal now warrants economic annihilation. What changed in 8 days? Carney stood on the world stage in Davos and told the global elite that the American-led international order is over. That middle powers must build strategic autonomy because great powers weaponize tariffs, use financial infrastructure as coercion, and exploit supply chains as vulnerabilities. He didn't name Trump. He didn't need to. Everyone knew exactly who he was talking about, and Trump's 100% tariff threat proves Carney was right. Let me show you the timeline because it's absolutely insane. January 16th, Beijing. Mark Carney meets President Xi Jinping. They announce a trade deal. Canada allows 49,000 Chinese electric vehicles into the market annually at 61% tariff instead of 100%. That's roughly what China was already exporting before tariffs hit, less than 3% of the Canadian auto market. In exchange, China drops canola seed tariffs from 76% to 15% by March 1st. Removes anti-discrimination tariffs on canola meal, lobsters, crabs, and peas through at least year-end. Nearly $3 billion in export orders unlocked for Canadian farmers. Basic trade diplomacy. Canada had tariffs hurting Chinese EV makers. China had tariffs destroying Canadian agriculture. Both sides negotiated a compromise. Trump's reaction? That's what he should be doing. It's a good thing for him to sign a trade deal. If you can get a deal with China, you should do that. He literally endorsed it. 8 days later, complete reversal. Now, the same deal is evidence Canada wants to become a drop-off port for Chinese goods flooding America. Now, China will eat Canada alive and destroy Canadian businesses, social fabric, and general way of life. Now, 100% tariffs on everything. What changed? Carney responded calmly but firmly. Canada doesn't live because of the United States. Canada thrives because we are Canadian. We are masters in our own house. This is our country. This is our future. The choice is ours. That's when Trump's entire posture toward the China deal shifted. On January 16th, Trump praised it. By January 24th, after Davos and Carney's refusal to play subordinate, Trump was threatening economic annihilation. The threat came via Truth Social Saturday morning. Kent called Carney Governor Carney instead of Prime Minister, the same mocking nickname he used for Justin Trudeau when suggesting Canada become the 51st state. He said Carney was sorely mistaken if he thought Canada could become a drop-off port for China. China will eat Canada alive, completely devour it, including the destruction of their businesses, social fabric, and general way of life. If Canada makes a deal with China, it will immediately be hit with a 100% tariff against all Canadian goods and products coming into the United States of America. This is extraordinary for multiple reasons. First, Canada already made the deal. It's done, announced. In effect, starting March 1st. Trump praised it a week ago. Now he's threatening retroactive punishment for something he previously supported. Second, the deal has nothing to do with Chinese goods flooding America. The 49,000 EVs allowed into Canada at reduced tariffs are for the Canadian market. They're not being re-exported to the United States. Canada isn't becoming a transshipment hub. The entire premise is nonsense. Third, 100% tariffs on all Canadian goods means economic catastrophe for both countries. Canada exported $352 billion in goods to the US in 2024. American companies imported those goods because they needed them. Lumber for construction, aluminum and steel for manufacturing, oil and natural gas for energy, automotive parts for vehicle production. Doubling the price overnight would devastate American industries and consumers. Fourth, it would violate USMCA, the trade deal Trump himself negotiated and signed. The agreement specifically prevents exactly this kind of arbitrary tariff imposition. Trump would be breaking his own signature achievement from his first term, but none of that matters because the threat isn't actually about Chinese goods or trade policy. It's about Carney refusing to be subordinate. It's about Canada building relationships that reduce dependence on American markets. It's about a middle power demonstrating that American leverage isn't absolute. Trump's panic reveals exactly what he's afraid of. For decades, Canada routed the vast majority of its trade through the United States because alternatives didn't exist or weren't economically viable. 75% of Canadian exports go to America. Canadian businesses plan around American demand. Canadian supply chains integrate with American production. That dependence gave Washington enormous leverage. Threatened tariffs and Canadian governments would scramble to negotiate. Demand policy changes and Canada would consider it seriously because access to American markets was existential. Carney is systematically dismantling that leverage. The China deal is just one piece. He's also negotiated new partnerships with Qatar on liquefied natural gas. He's strengthening ties with the European Union on trade and critical minerals. He's exploring deeper relationships with India after years of diplomatic strain. He's building the Churchill Port and Hudson Bay Railway to ship Canadian resources to Europe without touching American infrastructure. Every partnership that diversifies Canadian trade is leverage Trump loses. Every alternative market Canadian businesses develop is pressure Washington can't apply. Every supply chain that bypasses American territory is economic independence Trump can't tolerate. The Davos speech made this explicit. Carney wasn't just talking about China or Europe. He was announcing a comprehensive strategy of strategic autonomy. Build strength at home. Diversify partnerships globally. Reduce vulnerability to coercion from any single power, including and especially the United States. Trump initially praised the China deal because he thought it was just bilateral negotiation. Two countries solving trade irritants, no big deal. Then Carney stood in Davos and explained it was part of a broader strategy to make Canada less dependent on America. Suddenly, the same deal became an existential threat. Ontario Premier Doug Ford criticized the EV tariff reduction, warning it could hurt Canada's auto sector. He called Chinese EVs spy cars and said the deal would tick off the Americans. He was right about the last part, but not for the reasons he thought. Trump isn't mad about Chinese electric vehicles. He's mad that Canada negotiated with China independently, demonstrated that Canadian interests don't automatically align with American demands, and showed other middle powers that alternatives to American economic dominance exist. Trump also revoked Canada's invitation to his Board of Peace, the same day he threatened tariffs. The board costs dollars to join and supposedly oversees peace processes. Carney had expressed cautious interest after Davos. Trump withdrew the invitation, not over policy, over a speech he didn't like. This is Trump's pattern. Loyalty is the only currency. Disagree publicly and you're out. The invitation withdrawal was meant as punishment. Instead, it proved everything Carney said in Davos was correct. Trump's threat is probably unenforceable. 100% tariffs on all Canadian goods would require congressional approval for permanent implementation. It would devastate American industries. It would violate USMCA. Canada and Mexico could challenge through dispute resolution. It would unite American business lobbies, Canadian provincial governments, and international trade organizations against Washington. But the threat itself does damage. Canadian businesses planning investments must now consider whether American market access is reliable. Companies looking at expanding production in Canada have to factor in the risk that Trump could arbitrarily double their export costs. The uncertainty alone discourages economic activity. Carney's response will likely be measured. Canada won't retaliate immediately. Ottawa will continue implementing the China deal because the benefits for Canadian farmers are real and immediate. Carney will keep building alternative partnerships because reducing dependence on American markets is now obviously necessary, not just strategically wise. Other middle powers are watching closely. If Canada can negotiate with China despite American objections, if Carney can give speeches criticizing great power coercion without facing actual economic annihilation, if strategic autonomy is achievable rather than theoretical, then other countries might follow. That's what Trump fears most. Not Canadian electric vehicle imports, not China using Canada as a drop-off port. The possibility that American economic dominance is optional, that middle powers can chart their own courses, that threats and coercion eventually backfire when pushed too far. Trump thought demanding subordination would force compliance. Instead, he's triggering exactly the kind of strategic autonomy Carney described in Davos. Every threat makes alternatives more attractive. Every insult makes independence more appealing. Every arbitrary tariff announcement proves that American reliability is gone. Let's return to the central absurdity. January 16th, Trump said Carney signing a trade deal with China was a good thing. January 24th, the exact same deal warranted 100% tariffs on all Canadian goods. Nothing about the deal changed. The terms Carney announced in Beijing are the terms being implemented: 49,000 Chinese EVs at reduced tariffs. Chinese tariff relief on canola, lobster, crab, peas. Benefits for Canadian agriculture. Costs for Canadian auto sector. Net positive for Canadian economy overall. What changed was Carney's willingness to publicly articulate why the deal mattered, not just as bilateral trade, but as part of Canada building the partnerships and strategic autonomy necessary to withstand economic coercion from great powers who use integration as subordination. Trump praised the deal when he thought it was Canada being transactional. Negotiate with whoever offers the best terms, fine, as long as Canada still ultimately defers to American leadership. The moment Carney made clear the deal represented Canadian independence rather than just tactical bargaining, Trump panicked. The 100% tariff threat is Trump admitting Carney is right. If American leverage depended on Canadian dependence, and Canada is actively reducing that dependence, then Trump's only response is escalation. Threaten complete economic severance, hope the threat alone forces Canadian submission. But Carney already addressed this in Davos. Middle powers must develop the ability to withstand pressure. Sovereignty, that was once grounded in rules, will increasingly be anchored in the capacity to resist coercion. The question isn't whether to adapt to great power rivalry, but whether middle powers build higher walls or create genuine cooperation among themselves. Canada is choosing cooperation, with China on agriculture and EVs, with Europe on critical minerals and energy, with Qatar on Elwang, with Denmark on Arctic security, with other middle powers who recognize that American reliability under Trump is gone and alternatives must be built. Every partnership makes Trump's threats less effective. Every alternative market reduces American leverage. Every demonstration that Canada can thrive without American permission undermines the subordination Trump demands. The China deal was always going to benefit Canadian farmers. That's why Trump initially praised it. But after Davos, after Carney's speech made clear, this was about strategic autonomy rather than just trade. The deal became evidence that Canada is escaping American control, and Trump, faced with a middle power refusing to stay on the menu, threatened to burn down the entire relationship rather than accept that leverage has limits and coercion eventually fails. That's not strength, that's panic. And the 100% tariff threat proves everything Carney said in Davos was exactly right.